Okay, we're going to start in the minutes. So I would like to invite everyone to take their seats. And those who are outside to start making their way in. Okay, we're going to start in the minutes. So I would like to invite everyone to take their seats. Should I put on my jacket, Tasha? And those who are outside to start making their way in. Excellencies, ambassadors, colleagues from the African Union, colleagues from SAIA, Outer NEPID, leaders from our multilateral and regional banks, friends from business, civil society, and academia, good morning. We are going to start the session now. Ambassadors, colleagues from the African Union. I know we do have some people online. So my name is Nokutula Mene. I work for United Nations Development Program. And I have civil society been given the great pleasure of academia setting the scene for today's session. The session now. Ambassadors, colleagues from okay. It is a pleasure to open day 2. So my name is this event in a room like this with people in the room and online who set both policies and given the great pleasure. Today our task is simple to do, to state and to discuss, but very hard to do. Right, bring down the cost of capital so that African countries can finance development on fair terms. People in the room and online. Right, so the question is why this conversation and why now, right? It's because the ground has shifted. The financing for development processes has put real and workable ideas on the table to expand fiscal space and deal with debt stress. A borrowers forum is coming together so that countries can compare notes, coordinate positions, and speak with a clearer voice to creditors and investors. G20 finance ministers have agreed on a G20 framework for engagement on pillars, including the cost of capital. And a few weeks ago at the STC in Johannesburg, we saw the endorsement of the establishment and operationalization of an African debt monitoring mechanism. And crucially, I will underscore crucially, African Union now has a permanent seat at the G20. I want to emphasize that when we look at this, this is not just a nameplate. It means that African priorities can be backed by agendas from the start. It means that we are bringing 55 states to the table to discuss and to bring to the table how we handle debt, how we work out and price climate risk, how we use guarantees and other tools to lengthen maturities and cut spreads. It means coalition building is easier, and the story of markets here about Africa can be more consistent, evidence-based and timely. However, whilst we speak of all these great strides, we also need to be frank about what is at stake at the moment. In too many budgets, interest rates are squeezing out the very spending that drives resilience and growth, health, education, social protection, and infrastructure that unlocks productivity. I'll give 2 examples. South Africa will spend almost 400 billion on debt servicing costs this fiscal year. That's about 22 cents of every rand revenue. That is money that could otherwise be used to fund core services and investment. 22 cents of every rand revenue. Senegal's 2025 finance law allocates about 930 billion francs to interest and commissions alone, even before counting the principal. Real resources that could be redirected to SDG priorities. At the same time, the SDG financing gap remains vast, about 200 billion a year for Africa and around 4 trillion a year across developing countries. If we don't lower the financing cost and secure longer tenures, progress stalls. And as we look at these figures, we need to remember the grandmother who is in the rural area, who is looking forward to the government to provide healthcare. The young woman who has been impregnated in the rural area, who needs to give birth at a public hospital. And this is where we need to close the gap. But how do we do this when we are servicing so much debt? The good news is we know where the friction lies. We know what has put us in this place. UNDP's work on the cost of capital and cost of finance in Africa has shown how features of the intermediation chain and how sovereign risk is assessed can add up to what we're calling the African premium. That isn't fully explained by fundamentals. Our follow-up turned that analysis into a practical playbook for finance ministers, debt officers, and investor relations teams. The core message is not glamorous, but powerful. Credibility shown consistently gets priced. Regular, reliable data, clear fiscal anchors, reforms sequence so that markets can see traction, and steady engagement with rating agencies across the whole review cycle, not just at the end, will move the needle over time. So let me speak directly to some of the questions some of you have raised. Around an African credit rating agency. Our view is straightforward. More and better data methods that truly reflect African realities and healthy competition analysis can all improve how risk is measured and priced, so long as governance and independence are rock solid. It is no secret, colleagues, that at the moment, Africa pays a very high interest rate for debt, in the double digits, whereas developed countries are paying in the single digits. What is the explanation for that? There isn't really a credible explanation besides the fact that we are viewed as a risky lending partner. So one way we need to actually be able to debunk that riskiness, and the one way we debunk the riskiness is by credible data. We need to work on our data and improve that. There's also another stream of thought that is being put forward. The AU or APRM has put forward proposition that we need an Africa credit rating agency. The goal of this agency would be to complement, not replace, global agencies, add deeper local currency coverage, bring issuer and investors closer together, and produce analysis that markets actually use because it's rigorous, transparent, and comparable. Done well, this can reduce some of the risks that have been perceived. So with that framing, I would like to just propose a few things that we need to do and we need to think about as we do this. The first one, I think I've already spoken a lot to it, is around our data coverage. We need to be able to make sure that we are presenting credible data and that we're engaging throughout so that we can debunk the so-called risk premium. Secondly, we need to anchor the policy story and match it to the right instruments. We need to be clear about what our medium-term fiscal and debt strategy is and what we're aiming for and how we will get there. Then we need to pick instruments that translate that credibility into price, guarantees, and risk sharing. The anchor is the story. The instrument is how you turn the story into a cheaper, longer tenure money. Today, we'll start with a fireside chat on how to reduce the cost of capital, including improving and diversifying rating perspective. Then we will sit at the panel that will implement, that will bring back to implementation. And there we'll discuss an anchor of credit rating capability with strong guardrails, regional and national development banks providing patient capital, domestic market reforms, and broaden the investor base. But I'm sure my colleague Nancy will go a lot more into that. So let me close on two issues. It's issues of responsibility and issues of opportunity. Responsibility, because everything we say today should be doable by institutions in this room. Opportunity, because the AU membership in the G20 is a significant stride and a significant opportunity. It can induce better borrower coordination, a credible African rating capability, and smarter use of risk-sharing tools together, which will give us a real chance to blend the cost of capital curve. However, we need to all come to the table as countries and with our different institutions to see how do we ensure that we are feeding adequately into the AU and so that we can capitalize on its seat at the G20. These are not abstract goals that we talk about here. We need to be able to get our countries out of the debt spiral. We have ministers and governors who can commit, debt managers who can deliver, regional and multilateral partners who can de-risk, analysts and investors who can respond to credible signals, civil society and media who can hold us account, and academics who can help us learn faster. We do have the capacity. We just have to start doing and claiming our space on the global stage. If each of us leaves this room with 2 actions, commitment to clear policy anchors and commitment to action, this will not just be another meeting. It will be a solid step towards the right direction of making sure that we reduce the cost of capital to our African countries and the global South in general on one end, but also towards making sure we free up money to be able to achieve the SDG goals. So with that, I would like to just hand over and say, let us not make this a talk shop, but let us see how we credibly use our institutions and our seat as the African Union on the G20 table to advance the African agenda and the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Nugutula, and for setting the scene for what is surely to be a morning of fruitful discussions today around reducing the cost of capital in Africa. Just official greetings, everybody in the room and those online. My name is Kesau Baka, and I'm a G20 researcher with the South African Institute of International Affairs. I will be taking you through one of our, essentially the aims of our discussion here today. We're going to be having a targeted roundtable around rethinking Africa's debt, evaluating proposals from different global forums. And as my colleague Nukutula has just so rightly highlighted, we wanted to make sure that in light of the G20 conference, our first one in West Africa this year, we really wanted to make sure that we come out of here with tangible outcomes, actionable outputs out of this event. And this roundtable, I think, is a really good opportunity for us to ensure that that takes place. One of our colleagues here yesterday challenged us in this gathering that we should make sure that this is one gathering that produces a menu of actions around the issue of debt. And I'm very hopeful that through our discussions here today, we'll be able to accomplish that goal. So the thinking around having this roundtable discussion is really based on some of the engagements that we've had throughout this year, particularly one that we had in Addis Ababa, where the thinking or the aim was really to bring together a group of technical experts who are able to input into a short output document that we can then feed into policymakers so that we're able to really input into the G20 process, particularly at the time as we had been appointed as a resource partner for the South African government on the G20. So based on the success of that engagement, we figured that we would replicate a similar model here in Dakar. However, this one is based on a publication that my colleague, Professor Daniel Bradlow, and I are currently working on, which is essentially putting together a roadmap or action toolkit which emerged as a result of discussions that we had amongst ourselves at SAIA, really looking at 2025 as a year which had a lot of traction around debt and development finance, particularly the various expert panels that were put together across the different global processes, particularly within the UNFFD process, the expert panel on debt by the UNSG, the Jubilee report, which was commissioned by Pope Francis, as well as the expert review on debt, nature, and climate, and the upcoming report of the Africa Expert Panel on G20. You know, we viewed these milestones as very significant in terms of converging and recognizing that the debt crisis is a systemic issue, and one that is a threat to overall global financial stability. However, the gap that we had noticed in terms of these processes was that there was a problem of a lack. The problem was not necessarily the lack of expert solutions, given the wide variety of expert panels that were formed, but really that there was an issue of fragmentation across those initiatives. While they were producing very important and actionable proposals, these remained scattered and unevenly prioritized. So then we saw the need to really synthesize these proposals into a consolidated sort of repository of actions relevant to Africa that would essentially morph into an operational toolkit that evaluates the feasibility, identifies the bottlenecks, and really sets out a sequenced plan for Africa's short, medium, and long-term advocacy within these global forums around issues of debt and development finance. So I think just to highlight some of the key takeaways, particularly around the areas of convergence and divergence that we had identified across these expert panels and the reports that were produced. In terms of areas of convergence, we noted that all of these reports converge in terms of agreeing that there's a need for the reform of the multilateral system. So in terms of strengthening MDB capital adequacy and revising the IMF World Bank debt sustainability frameworks to integrate climate and nature risks. We also saw a wide recognition of innovative debt instruments. There was strong alignment around debt for nature swaps, sustainability linked bonds, and climate resilient debt clauses as pragmatic pathways to debt sustainability. We also saw agreement around private capital mobilization, particularly the Bridgetown Initiative and the UNSG expert group both emphasized credit guarantees, blended finance, and equity-like instruments to reduce risk premiums on African borrowing. We also saw a strong emphasis on the need for institutional strengthening. Just as a way of highlight, the expert review on debt, nature, and climate called for technical assistance and domestic resource mobilization to manage debt more sustainably, really echoing Africa's own push for domestic mechanisms such as the debt monitoring mechanism that we heard about from Dr. Olomo's presentation yesterday, as well as the financing stability mechanism. However, what we noticed is that the approaches in terms of these reports and these panels differ significantly in terms of the means and the pace of reform. So a few areas of divergence or conflicts that we noted was around systemic versus incremental reform. So for instance, you found that the Bridgetown Initiative calls for a structural shift in liquidity provisioning and MDB governance, whereas on the other side, you see an emphasis by the UNSG expert group on political feasibility and near-term reforms like maturity extensions and liability management operations. We also saw a sort of imbalance or conflict between advancing debt cancellation versus debt restructuring. You find within the Jubilee report, for instance, a stronger advocacy for cancellations, while the UNSG expert group really highlights the political limits of such an approach, especially under current creditor fragmentation. There's also a bit of diversions around climate debt linkages. So for instance, while the expert review embeds debt within nature and climate resilience, you saw others focusing more narrowly on fiscal liquidity and creditor coordination. So what does this mean? It actually highlights that there's a need for within the continent. Oh, for the interpretation, sorry. Apparently I'm speaking too fast, so let me just slow it down a bit. So in terms of the implications of these findings, is really that there's a need for prioritization by policymakers and other African actors within negotiations to really prioritize which initiatives are more important within the context of the AU and African countries. And just to give a sort of preliminary highlight of how we propose to sort of approach this roadmap or action plan, is that in the short term, what would be necessary is to really push for politically feasible reforms. So, am I still speaking fast? Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So within the short term, we really emphasize the need to push for politically feasible reforms where there has been some form of alignment, particularly when you look at some of the G20 outcome documents, for instance, issues of comparability of treatment, issues that all stakeholders agree of present concern and would be sort of lower hanging fruits within the short term for advocacy within the global forums. We heard from Dr. Olomo yesterday around the establishment of an African debt monitoring mechanism. We see this as an important step towards ensuring that there's transparency and data on the continent to be able to push for some of those reforms in the short term. Within the medium term, we propose advocating for revising global debt sustainability frameworks, operationalizing the African financing stability mechanism, particularly given that Africa is the only region which does not have a regional financial safety net. Within the long term as well, we propose pursuing structural reforms. So issues around a multilateral or an intergovernmental institution around debt would be the kind of reforms that you would push in the long term, as we don't see these as being feasible within the short term. One particular point that we emphasized is the importance of the African Union and African countries in pursuit of a common African position on debt, which we got an update on yesterday around the adoption at this year's STC, was that it would be important to ensure that the African Union and African governments have a clearly articulated normative stance on debt that sets out what we believe are expectations for borrowers and lenders, and what that means in terms of responsibility. And in this regard, we had proposed a conceptual framework based on my colleague, Professor Denny Bradlow's already pre-existing work on what is called the Dove Fund principles, which are essentially a set of principles that set out a framework for debt restructurings and entering into debt contracts that really maximizes an optimal outcome for both parties. So some of the guiding principles of that normative framework would be around transparency. So negotiating parties and all affected parties having access to information they need in order to make informed decisions regarding a debt transaction. And another principle was on due diligence, ensuring that the sovereign debtor and its creditors should each undertake appropriate due diligence before concluding a sovereign debt transaction. And then the optimal outcome assessment, at the earliest feasible moment, the negotiating parties should publicly disclose why they expect, for instance, their restructuring agreement to result in an optimal outcome. There's an outcome that, considering the circumstances in which the parties are negotiating and their respective rights, obligations, and responsibilities, offers each of them the best possible mix of economic, financial, environmental, social, human rights, and governance benefits and costs. And another principle is on monitoring, that debt transactions should incorporate credible mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of the agreement, and then maintaining market access within the context of a restructuring. Each sovereign debt transaction, to the greatest extent possible, should be designed to facilitate future market access for the borrower. So essentially, these are a list of preliminary recommendations which we had made on the normative side. Another angle that we thought was important to consider was the operational feasibility of some of the reforms that are being suggested, both in the short, medium, and long term. And we acknowledge that it's quite apparent that achieving progress in multilateral advocacy requires the AU and African countries to focus on how they organize, how they coordinate, and how they project influence. Firstly, we emphasize that the AU should institutionalize a standing coordination and negotiation unit tasked with preparing common African positions, drawing inputs from regional bodies, ministries, and expert networks well ahead of major forums such as the G20, the UN. Africa must also invest in its negotiating capacity, so expanding the pool of trained experts that are seconded to international meetings and embedding technical specialists within the missions to ensure continuity and institutional memory. We also emphasize the need to leverage alliances strategically, partnering with global South actors like India, Brazil, Barbados to shape reform coalitions and strengthen Africa's moral leverage in global finance debate. And finally, self-financing participation and establishing a continental knowledge and advocacy platform will reduce dependence on external partners and ensure Africa's positions are evidence-based, coherent, and consistently advanced across multilateral spaces. So we wanted to just take this opportunity of this roundtable to draw on the expertise of the experts around the table to really highlight for us what they think would be the important sort of low-hanging fruits within the short term, the medium term, and the long term in order to inform this action advocacy plan. We have a couple of initial discussants who will then frame and pose some of those questions for us, and essentially set the scene for more discussions around how we can ensure that this publication and this action plan actually reflects the views of the expertise and also informs a tangible action plan moving forward. So with that being said, I'll call on the first of our experts to respond to these remarks and also highlight some guiding questions in terms of what they think would be important to flesh out in the context of this action plan. So I'm going to call on Ms. Aja Diagne from the Islamic Development Bank to kick us off, and then I'll then move on to the others. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. So my name is Hanata Diagne. I am an economist for the ISDB Regional Hub of Dakar, which is the Islamic Development Bank, MDB. So really, first of all, Thank you for this presentation. And really what I would like to highlight is that from our perspective, you will see, because in my line of work, we draft strategies for these countries in helping them in their structural transformation and sort of framing our partnerships with them. But we have ambitious strategies, and we are often hampered by the financing envelope that are available for these countries. For example, the regional hub of Dakar covers 7 countries. Out of these 7 countries, 5 are really debt constrained. So how do we move from this is really what this roadmap is all about. But there are certain concerns that we need to highlight, which are the realities that we face within MDBs. We are asking often for MDBs to pool more concessional resources, but the reality is that we really need to be realistic about the constraints that we are facing, because as we know, MDBs, they primarily mobilize resources through two channels. One is their capital resources, and the second one is through AAA rated bonds. So in this fiscal context that our member countries are facing, it would be really difficult to ask our member countries that are already constrained to pool higher capital contributions. At the same time, so this is why it's really important that now we have this call for a unified African position. A unified African position, I would really like to extend that to the fact that, for example, the Islamic Development Bank is one of the few South-South MDB. So we are requesting for our countries to have a unified voice, but I think it's also an opportunity for us, South-South MDBs, to have a unified voice because we are closer to the realities of our member countries. And in that way, by pooling our resources, we can enhance the leverage our member countries have in terms of negotiation, etc., whether it is within the G20 or other particularly on issues such as the DSA. We are clients of the DSA, and they sort of direct our lending policies. And so we should be able to have higher influence over the matrix of this DSA. So that's one aspect of it. Another one is that we often talk about the quantity of debt, but we have leverage on the quality of debt, which is what I think the most important matter, and where we actually have room to act immediately by sort of changing the type of finance that we offer. It's not, so as I said, it's not just about the quantity, but the quality. So we need asset-backed instruments that are really financing the real economy and the tangible economy. We need de-risking instruments, of course, that allow us to foster growth. And at ISDB, we try to do this by leveraging and deploying certain instruments. We have something called the Lives and Livelihood Fund. And through the Lives and Livelihood Fund, through partnerships, we try to leverage and pull together different resources, whether they are philanthropic, whether they are private, or from MDBs, in order to finance poverty reduction. We also have other instruments such as the Sukuk, which is a way for us to leverage and pull strong capital for great infrastructure projects. We also have one instrument that allows us to not really touch on our country's debt, which is the WAF. And through the WAF, we are really able to have an asset-backed instrument which will deploy over time, and the resources from these asset-backed instruments are put back into the economy through social sectors such as education, health, etc. We will finance through certain infrastructures. We will be able to finance social projects. And also for the LLF, one of the innovative ways in LLF is that for every dollar that we have in debt, there's a 35% grant element. So that's something we really try to leverage on. And so after having said all that, I just wanted to really highlight that through these kind of instruments, we can create partnerships. And to move forward this roadmap, we need to make sure that we assign champions. When we assign champions, we are sure that actually we can follow up on the actions that we have decided on. We can assign champions for the DSA reform, the advocacy, the debt monitoring, but also to sort of learn from some of the financing innovations. We could have a really technical working group within these institutions that will scale all of the proven models that we have, that I've mentioned earlier. So this African roadmap, of course, it acknowledges the constraint of debt, but also provides us with an opportunity to put forth sustainable quality financing. And I think this is mostly what the African strategy should be about. And again, in a united voice of Southern institutions, and which will allow us to sort of align our financing to the development goals that we all have. I think in a nutshell, those are some of the points I would have on the great propositions you have made. So I'll give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I particularly like the proposal around the importance of assigning champions so that we are able to really follow up on the actions that we propose, particularly around the establishment of technical working groups in order to be able to then scale the solutions that we're able to come up with. Thank you very much for those initial reflections. I think just to maintain balance, I'll then now switch to one of our online participants, perhaps Mr. Admasu Tades, if he's online with us, to maybe come in here with his reflections as well.
Good morning. I hope you can all hear me and see me as well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to salute both Kesa Obwaka and Nokutula for the excellent briefing, the way we framed all the issues. I think we've taken stock in a way that is really comprehensive. I had the benefit of being at the Addis Ababa meeting, and I remember there we were having a lot of, very good discussions, but I think the way in which this project has brought it all together and really framed it in a way that we can all start moving towards action, as has been said. So first of all, I just thought I'd, acknowledge all of the very good work that's been done. I thought I would perhaps focus on what was prompted as the matter of low-lying fruit, because I think there is a great deal that needs to be done. I think the framework is quite comprehensive. There's clearly a lot on our plates, but I think, given some of the urgency that some of our constituencies are facing, both sovereigns and also institutions that support those sovereigns, there's a number of things that have been covered very well. But I would think as we sort of gear up for the G20 engagements coming up in a few weeks, I think there's a number of things that perhaps can be sort of crystallized and moved quite quickly. And so in the context of scarcity, I think as Madame Diagne has mentioned, MDBs do rely on of course the same sovereigns, and we know sovereigns are very stretched these days, ODA is coming down. So what is politically feasible? What's practical? And I think the one thing that we've heard very clearly is the matter of guarantees. And the beautiful thing about guarantees is even though there's capital allocations that are required behind the guarantees, it's not something that is as demanding as providing deep concessional funding in liquid terms. So I think there's a lot that can be done to support very quickly a number of measures that would help ease some of the pressure. For instance, credit enhancing new debt raising and credit enhancing, measures that involve refinancing. I think these would be very doable in the short term on the back of consensus that can be built up around the G20 sitting. I think apart from credit enhancement and related refinancings on affordable terms, I think we've heard about swaps. There have been quite a few swaps that have been done. The swaps do involve guarantees as well. So I think that would be part of that sort of bucket of low-lying fruit. The other thing, maybe from a policy and institutional perspective, is if we can sort of put a bit more squarely on the table, because as we've heard, the AU is now part of the G20. I think the AU should be a guardian of Pan-African institutions, financial institutions that play systemic roles. So I think here we do need to try to see if we can get some resolution on what is referred to by ratings agencies and other stakeholders as policy importance, right? So I think we heard from Nokutula quite a bit about ratings and how one can improve the process and improve the rigor and ensure that there's more being captured in those critical ratings exercises. One of the things that go with ratings, apart from all the good data and analysis that needs to be done, is judgments around policy importance. And I think here, in an environment now where Africa has to look more and more to itself to really, take a bigger share or more active and dynamic and catalytic role in financing Africa's own development, we have to make sure that African financial institutions, African agency is given the right level of consideration. And I think this is something that can be, harvested as part of the low-hanging fruit that Kesa Obaka has reminded us that we need to be prioritized in what we're trying to achieve. And so again, apart from those short-term measures I referred to earlier on, there is this matter of, really trying to just, bed down once and for all this issue of policy importance of African financial institutions. I stress this because I have very deep personal experience in this area, because you see this particular matter not being given adequate attention in the final judgments that happen. I think, Noktula, you said that it's not just in the last stages of the rating exercise, but it's the entire process, right? And I think one of the things we've discovered is there's quite a bit of subjectivity on some of these judgmental areas, and this is where Africa can come out quite resolutely, very clear and upfront about it, and just to say that, Africa needs to ensure that systemic considerations and critical financial institutions need to be considered in all of these global exercises. So, debt restructuring, debt management issues increasingly these days involve African financial institutions. If we go back to the HIPC days, it was really largely an external exercise. These days, we've seen that it's not just new players like the Chinese and the Gulf lenders and the Indians, but we're also seeing African financial institutions in the mix. And one of the difficult lessons that's been learned is African financial institutions have not been included in some of the discussions that have led to these very long-winded, delayed, and really suboptimal exercises, like the Zambia one, for instance. It's taken several years, and the African agenda here would be to say, how come everybody's at the table except the African financial institutions, who also play a very important role in providing the financing. And again, I think the AU needs to put it very firmly out there that when the lights are out and when everybody runs for the hills, it's the African financial institutions who remain in Africa and who sometimes are lenders of last resort that needs to be recognized in terms of policy importance, right? Market failure and the like. And so these are some short-term measures that can be really effected without necessarily competing with the scarcity issue that has been rightfully highlighted by Madame Diagne and others. We know that there are very specific issues around, resource scarcity, especially with ODA and the like. But some of these particular measures would not necessarily be constrained by that, and I think that should be given specific focus as a way of harvesting some of this low-hanging fruit that Kesa Obaka, gave us a cue to focus on to get some actionable proposals going forward in the immediate term. I just thought I would highlight a couple of other areas. I think, new and expanded partnerships is another way of helping to close the gaps because we know that, this is an environment where even if the ratings are improved, you know, there's just generally a bigger problem of scarcity, even in the developed markets, as we've seen with fiscal positions being very stressed and monetary policy being tight still, even though there's good indications that there's some relaxation around the corner. And so I think new and expanded partnerships, there's ways and means of doing that without getting caught up again in this structural discussion around scarcity and new priorities around defense spending and new nationalism coming in the capital surplus countries. Partnerships don't always compete with those. There's ways and means in which institutions that are well capitalized, that have balance sheets, the bilateral agencies, but also some of the MDBs, they can actually strengthen African financial institutions by providing not just concessional financing. We know that is very scarce and difficult to move in big numbers, but hybrid capital is an innovation that has recently become quite acceptable. There's no resistance to that anymore. I think ratings agencies have factored that now into their methodologies. And so I think that's another way in which, we can perhaps get some short to medium term action going is to really put a bigger premium on hybrid capital. And it's interesting because hybrid capital has certain features to it that lends itself to actionability without getting caught up in political trade-offs that are difficult for some of the countries that can provide that hybrid capital. We've seen the World Bank achieve it. We've seen the African Development Bank do it. We at TDB Group have rolled out $100 million of hybrid capital earlier this year, and we think that can really be scaled up. Not just conventional hybrid, but I think in the case of refinancings and other areas, we can look at concessional hybrid, which is another way of reducing the cost of refinancings for sovereigns that are in a very difficult space. And I think these are, examples of specific things that can be done. Maybe just something I didn't mention in the context of policy importance. I just think, sometimes these conversations have to be quite detailed because these technical discussions are usually quite elaborate. And so as we engage on the issue of policy importance of African financial institutions, we should make sure that we don't get caught up in this issue that African financial institutions are not AAA, and because they're not AAA, they don't provide the very, very low cost funding that the AAA folks are able to provide. Because that can become a trap for us because by structural design, we will never be AAA unless we have major capital from, the highly rated G7 type countries. But we have a policy importance role. We have a market failure role. We are lenders of last resort in a number of areas. And that should be used to make the point around policy importance without us getting, trapped in the conversation that, African FIs don't have the AAA and therefore they're not able to provide the lowest cost funding. Because I found that to be a tricky aspect in the discussions. And the reason we're not able to provide as low cost funding as some of the AAA folks is because we're hamstrung by the same institutions in those jurisdictions that just label us and don't give us the full benefit of the treatment we should have so that we can have higher ratings. So I'm just sort of trying to make it clear that we need to kind of pop the bubble there where there's this contradiction where by definition, because you come from a less prosperous region and therefore you don't have the high ratings, by definition, you shouldn't be important. And I think there's a flaw there, and I think it's not been brought out very well, and I think that's a loop that we need to find a way to close. The last thing I'll just say is, we do need to also recognize that it's not all about just financing in from a debt perspective. Risk capital is so important for various reasons. And I think again here we've not had enough risk capital. Some of you may have heard of this new initiative called Mission 300, where we're looking to electrify 300 million Africans by 2030. The World Bank, the African Development Bank are major tier one global type MDBs who are leading, and we are a strategic partner to them. We have about $1 billion or so of special purpose funding, and we've put a portion of that into an equity fund now to help smaller African type SMEs who are sometimes working in rural areas in off-grid solutions. And as much as they hold a lot of promise, there's only so much you can give them by way of debt, right? They need risk capital because you can't scale them up purely with debt. It doesn't work, right? It's not feasible. And so, I think there's been a very interesting case now where we've just signed off together with our partners a new permanent capital vehicle that will allow us to support some of these deserving enterprises, these SMEs, and maybe mid-sized companies who are doing very important infrastructure work, but they're hamstrung by risk capital. And we just don't have enough venture capital, but also other types of risk capital. And so I don't know how we can bring that back into focus. And I say this because unfortunately the jury out there has kind of found that private equity has not performed well in Africa. So we have this huge gap on risk capital, and the experience of the past 10 to 20 years has not been a positive one, generally speaking. Of course, in the common currency zone of West Africa, there's been a slightly better story there, but generally the African private equity story hasn't been good. And so that doesn't help us on this issue of providing risk capital. And once all the debt issues go away, if we're going to scale up and start moving towards the SDGs and the Agenda 2063, we're going to have to just put risk capital into the sales of African enterprises for jobs and everything else. And of course, in this regard, as we talk about risk capital and related African capital issues, I think we need to bring back into focus the 5% agenda that has already been put out there. But the question is, is African institutional money flowing better to the asset classes where it can make a difference? And we're at many forums where we hear there's $3-4 trillion of African institutional capital out there, but how much of this really is flowing into the development finance asset class that can actually absorb that kind of capital and return it on meaningful terms and provide the impact that is required. And so there, I think I know the AU has put it very strongly on the table, and there's Ayuda and others who've continued to sort of beat those drums. But I think the regulators and the custodians of this African institutional capital need to be encouraged further. And this is not about the rest of the world. This is about Africa itself. We as Africans have to put our money where our mouth is. And if we're not able to lead with our own capital, I think the rest of the world will sometimes not find us to be as serious as we should be found. So I'll stop here. I hope you are able to hear me, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Almasu. I just want to highlight a couple of things that I thought were of importance in framing the discussion as well. Firstly, on some of the low-hanging fruits that you highlighted around the importance of taking advantage of guarantees and credit enhancing measures, as well as debt swaps. And also, I think the issue around highlighting issues of policy importance, particularly the role of African multilateral institutions and the importance of recognizing them in terms of policy actions as lenders of last resort is also quite an important factor that I think as we continue these discussions, we need to also consider. And I think the point around the importance of also leading with our own capital on the continent is one that I would also like to emphasize. With that being said, I will now come back to the room and call up Dr. Dauda to come and give us his initial reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kesa, and thank you very much also, Admasu, for this very, very insightful remarks that you gave us. Definitely, we all share actually the very sort of informative points that you made earlier. So I think on my side, I'll try to have sort of some remarks that are focused on providing input on the African advocacy roadmap that Kesa talked about earlier. And of course, give you some perspective, having been not only a member of the G20 African expert panel set up by South Africa, but also having been also former member of the Jubilee Commission that was set up by the Vatican and led by Professor Stiglitz. So let me first start by sort of reaffirming the fact that it is critical to very much have a advocacy roadmap on that. Why? Because at the end of the day, I think, Kesa, you talked about all of those initiatives that have been actually sort of undertaken. Not only the, those two, the panel expert that I talked about, but also the Jubilee Commission, but also those that were formed by the UN Secretary General and also by some countries on debt. So there, we counted that there was at least 7 of those type of initiatives. So at the end of the day, those initiatives would come each with some recommendations. And the chance for those recommendations to be implemented are very much narrow if there is no coordination among those. And I think you made that good point that definitely we need to emphasize that there is a need for having a strong advocacy strategy to have any chance for these recommendations on debt that are relevant to African countries to be implemented. And I think the success of this advocacy strategy, would actually hinge on the number of points. The first point that is important is having common African position on debt. And there, I think I would very much, of course, acknowledge and comment what the African Union has been trying to do on that front. We have Patrick online, and who yesterday reminded us what they did in Lomé. Actually, I was there, and we very much welcome that sort of unprecedented efforts to shape African position on debt. I think this is the first starting point. If you want to advocate for something, we need to have one common position that everyone would actually push for. And unfortunately, that has not always been the case when it comes to debt in Africa. We used to have low-income country having some sort of, position on debt that are different from the one that other emerging market middle-income countries have. And I think that's not the way to go. We all need to speak with one voice, and then I guess our advocacy strategy would sort of build around that position that we do have. So that's important. But beside the fact that we need to have one voice, we also need to have a position on debt that is holistic, that actually also recognize the heterogeneity of the circumstances. Not all countries actually do have the same circumstances. I mean, I talked about low-income countries. Definitely, they don't have the same priorities when it comes to that with, let's say, a country like South Africa, which is a more emerging market, and etc. So we also even have also some fragile states that are also having different sort of realities. So we need to have a holistic approach, and that common position, African position, needs to recognize that. And I think what is important is at this stage, we are, I think the last count that we made, I think we all know that the IMF and World Bank debt sustainability analysis identify more than 20 countries in Africa that are either in debt distress already or at high risk of debt distress. And I think this is a huge number. Out of 54, having about more than 20 that are actually in that position is something that is really showing that there is a big problem that needs to be addressed. And I think on top of that, we also have our UN colleagues who estimated that there are over 3.4 billion people around the world who are living in countries that spend more on education, I mean, on debt service payment than education and health. This is actually quite a striking number. And I think out of those 3.4, it is estimated that many hundreds, around 700 or 800, are in Africa. This is something that definitely needs to be addressed. So it means that we need to have current, immediate measures that needs to be implemented. And I think when we talked about that, we're talking about those countries that are already in debt distress, they need relief. And that you cannot get if they don't have the opportunity to restructure their debt in a fair, sustainable, and transparent manner. Unfortunately, the G20 had set up the common framework to play that role, but we all know that it has not delivered it as well as we wanted. I mean, we don't need to remind the example of Zambia having gone through more than 3 years of hardship, whereby actually the scarce resources that were available were sort of allocated to debt service payment instead of other priorities that we talked about. So we definitely need to have a functional, fair, and sort of a sustainable debt restructuring mechanism. And I think the sooner the better. That's one. And I think many of these initiatives that we refer to, including, of course, the GBD Commission and others, have called for that. I am also very much excited about the work we did for South Africa as part of the G20 Africa Expert Panel. It's definitely the report will be out before the G20 Leaders Summit later this month, and you will see actually what also we propose on that. So that's very much important. Second, the question is not just to address the current debt crisis, it's also how we can avoid recurrent debt crisis. 25 years ago, we were talking about a similar situation, and we came up with the HIPIC initiative, and then a generation after, we are in the same situation. So how can we make sure that we take necessary action to avoid this type of debt crisis to come recurrently on the continent? And I think one thing that is very much important is, and I think it was pointed out by many of you, Nokutula and of course Kesa, we need to make sure that there is both, when you talk about the debt crisis, it's a shared responsibility. We tend to think about, oh, well, the creditors are responsible. Well, borrowers also have their share of responsibilities, and we have to recognize it. Sometimes there has not been always wise and responsible lending. Borrowing. At the same time, of course, there has been also irresponsible lending also. So we need to have more sort of responsible borrowing and lending practices. And I think that's on both fronts. But that being said, I think another thing that is very critical, to be very concrete, is we need to develop our African financial architecture. It starts with having strong domestic and regional markets, capital markets and financial markets, But also, and I fully agree with Admasu there, we need to have a greater role for our African multilateral financial institutions. And we should not, stand by while actually there are existential threat to some of those institutions. When it comes to, we are all seeing what being said about, organization like Afreximbank, for instance. That would be actually a loss for Africa if we are not able to make sure that yes, if there are issues to be addressed within those institutions, we address them, and steadfastly, if we need to increase their capital, we need to do it steadfastly. If we need to sort of reform some of the regulations so that they can operate better, we need to do it steadfastly, but we should not allow for any other external factors to really impede their ability to serve our continent. And I think actually they are, lenders of last resort, as Matsu said, and we definitely need to make sure that we capitalize on that. And if we don't, I think there would be a huge gap that we will be continuing to face. And I think it's the other point that I wanted to make. If we want to avoid future crises, we need to address the issue of the high cost of capital across the continent. And I think when you talked about that, one of the key issues is how we reduce risk. And risk actually has two facets. It's the actual risk, the real risk that, of course, many countries may be actually facing, but also the perceived risk, which is sometimes even more detrimental to our countries in Africa than actually the actual risk. So that we need to do a better job of making sure that those are addressed well. And of course, you cannot do that. You can do that in many ways. First of all, I think I don't need to come back to all of those innovative credit enhancement mechanisms that Admasu talked about. We need to scale them for Africa. We need to allocate more credit enhancement resources so that the MDBs, whether they're African or multilateral global, can actually use them. ISDB, of course, I think what Aja said earlier, we fully subscribe, and I think we welcome the work that these MDBs have been doing. We need to sort of give them more resources, but not just giving them more resources, but we need also to keep them accountable. What we have seen also in the past is, these global MDBs receiving a lot of resources, but refusing to extend them to countries that need them for many reasons. Some internal reasons, like for instance, some very conservative safeguard. I've been for a long time at the IMF. I can definitely tell you how sometimes those institutions can be very much risk averse when it comes to some countries like low-income countries. That should not be acceptable. If we make an effort at the G20 level to free more resources for these MDBs, we are expecting them that they extend it to those countries, of course, while taking the necessary safeguard, but not necessarily, not failing to do it because of risk aversion. And I think one thing that is critical also is, and we didn't talk about it, is we need also, if you want to address baseless risk perception, you need to make sure that investors do have the correct measure of risk when they want to come to any African country. So one of the initiatives that the G20 has been taking was to, what is called the GEMS initiative, which is actually to democratize access to credit risk data. I think this is important because when people look at historical risk data in Africa and compare it, it's not necessarily the worst in the world, but unfortunately, because of perceptions, people tend to think that Africa is the riskiest place to do business. There are some data that would show you that if you look at the failure of repayment or by many regions, by region, Africa would not be the last one. And those that, I would not name, but there are many other, some other part of the world where they have not been actually as credit-worthy as Africa, just to say the least. Finally, and I don't want to be too long, I think two things that are also important for advocacy strategy to be successful is that we do have good coordination among all actors that are involved. in implementing this, the strategy. And of course, here I talked earlier about making sure that all of these initiatives are better coordinated, those DEP initiatives, whether they are from the continent or beyond. But we also need our institutions to be also better coordinated. It starts with, of course, the African Union. And I think also previous speakers also talk about the need for the African Union to be also better coordinated with regional economic communities. And I'm sure there are some efforts there, but there is still scope to do something there, but not just between Pan-African and regional institution, but also with national institution, a national organization. And I think when we talked about reforming the debt restructuring framework, I mean, the experience of borrowers like Zambia or Ethiopia and others is something that should be so valuable that could also facilitate, sharing of experience among countries, but also facilitate the coordination among the Pan-African, regional, and national organization. And last but not least, I think the importance of collaboration and partnerships. Of course, first of all, between the two representatives of Africa at the G20. So I'm talking about the African Union and South Africa. Definitely, this is already happening. My brother, Patrick, who is online, is with me, actually a member of the G20 Africa expert panel. This is already showing also how committed South Africa is to making sure that the African Union is playing a critical role in this process. But definitely at all time, since those are the two only representatives of the continent at the G20, strong coordination, collaboration, and continued partnership will be needed for that, definitely. And second, we have to say that even if we do have representative, I think someone said yesterday something very important is that presence is not power. And I think this is something that we need to remember. Having a seat doesn't make your voice heard. And oh yeah, I think it was Fatu who was saying that yesterday. I can see her there. And this is something that definitely we need to keep in mind, is that although we have now two seats at the table, it doesn't mean that our voice is going to be heard. So how to make it heard? I would say two ways, and I will stop there. I've been talking just, and I'm pretty sure that there are some other issues that we need to discuss about. Two ways that we need to make sure that our presence at the G20 is having effect. First is to find a way also to build coalitions with other G20 members. So I think South African African Union should do that. Others that we have a lot of friends of Africa at the G20. I think it's good to very much try to see how we can build those coalitions and make sure that they support it. But at the end of the day, from my experience, we also need to keep in mind, even if we are around the table, the decision that we make sometimes are influenced by people who are outside the room. So what it means is we also need to have stronger partnership between our two representatives with non-G20 actors. It starts with, organization like a think tank that are represented here, Elizabeth and Saya team, and a set of in Ghana and other think tank. But not just think tank, all the civil society organization, but also some of the, academia and media, etc. But the reality is all successful advocacy strategy have been conducted by advocacy partners that are all over, not just in Africa. And we, I think we need to keep in mind that our friends and allies do not necessarily have to be on the continent. We do also have some outside the continent, and we need to make sure that we also use their resources and leverage actually their powers and capability to make sure that the position that we have been successfully able to sort of form with the EU leaderships are being pushed by all of those friends and allies that are within the G20 forum, but also outside the G20, within Africa and outside Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dauda, for that very comprehensive sort of analysis and really giving us key points. of your suggestions and solutions in terms of taking the advocacy strategy forward. I'll just highlight a few. Really the importance of the Common African Position on Debt, which Dr. Olomo will speak to shortly, and also the importance of the strategy being very holistic in the sense that it takes into account the different circumstances of African countries. I think another important aspect that we need to keep in mind in the discussions is your emphasis on the sort of balance between being reactive and proactive, that there are some countries that need immediate measures that current mechanisms such as the G20 Common Framework are unable to provide at the moment, and to really reflect on what the solutions for that are. And within this context, I would also just put it out or pose the questions around the utility of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable and how we can really leverage that platform to try and move the needle on some of those issues. I think another important point that you raised is around shared responsibility of both lenders and borrowers, emphasizing the point that Admasu had also raised around the role of African multilateral institutions and their critical importance on the continent, and really also highlighting some of the practical institutional issues that we need to fix in order to ensure that such a strategy works around issues of coordination. And perhaps here I'll also just throw it to the room to maybe think about whether there's a need for some form of centralized mechanism for coordinating, for instance, G20 positions, actions moving forward. I think I'll leave it there for now, and the rest we shall raise in the discussions. At this moment, I will now call on Dr. Olomo online to give us his reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kesa, and good afternoon to you all. I do really appreciate the way the discussion is unfolding, and critical points that were raised by my dear brother Admasu and my brother, member of the G20 expert panel, who highlighted, the excellent work that we've been doing with the G20 South African presidency. I want to begin by saying that we are seeing now, the real sense of what it means, the Africa time, because when you look at what we've been able to achieve since we started the year 2025, you can understand that it is only highlighting one thing, that when Africa is united, we can speak one voice and we can turn the challenges to real opportunities. And on the debt discussion, as we highlighted yesterday, what we have done was that we wanted to open a line of reflection on how the continent can reposition itself in the global discussion. And I think that the two speakers who spoke before, Admasu and my dear brother Semben, were absolutely clear, because they were able to outline how our priorities can be captured in an action-oriented way. Having said this, though, it is important to also recognize the fact that we are navigating in an extremely turbulent environment. We can, tell you about, the discussions that we're having at the G20 that are extremely difficult discussions, because sometimes it is extremely hard to reach consensus. I heard about collaboration between the South African G20 presidency and the African Union, and I want to reassure you that our collaboration has been extremely excellent because we've been able to align our perspectives in terms of what needed to be submitted at the G20 and how we can push together to have a good outcome. I want to reassure you that this collaboration, which has taken, bold steps in 2025, will certainly continue beyond the South African G20 presidency, because as I highlighted yesterday, we proposed and it was endorsed the Africa Engagement Framework. The Africa Engagement Framework provided an opportunity for the G20 South African presidency to extend the possibility and the potential of their presidency beyond 2025. And this is, in our perspective, one of the key achievements that we can put, into consideration by our colleagues and, the continent. Having said that, I heard speaking about the role of the African Union in, strengthening the capacities and actions and the role of our financial institutions. I want to highlight some points just to make sure that we understand the dynamics that are involved here. The first thing is that in 2023, we have supported the launch here at the African Union in 2024, we have supported the launch of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, which is the first ever alliance of African multilateral financial institutions to ensure that those institutions play their role in a much more practical way to support Africa's structural transformation. The good thing is that my dear brother Atmasu, the head of the TDB, is part of that important continental financial structure, which brings together all our multilateral financial institutions to ensure that they speak in unison and that they are able to work together, building on their respective mandate and, comparative advantages to ensure that there is coherence in the actions that they are driving forward. That was one of the first steps, putting in place that, multilateral financial institutions, setup that brings together those institutions. And we can see the fruits today because they are able to provide, as Atmasu highlighted, the last resort financing to our member states who are desperately in need of financial resources. Having this in place also brings challenges. One of the challenges that those institutions are facing is that for some of them, their preferred creditor status is not recognized by external parties. And in this, the African Union has taken bold steps through the Special Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration, the STC on finance. Since the 7th STC, there is a consistent reminder of the position of the continent in support of the preferred creditor status of those institutions. This means that for Africa, the protection of multilateral financial institutions that are operating in the continent that are Pan-African institutions is one of the first ever objective that the AU is pursuing. We have done that throughout the years to find a way of protecting those institutions. We are also conducting some of the advocacy and negotiations between those institutions that are affected by international ratings and the member states that are involved in the process of maybe downgrading those institutions. This tells you that we remain firmly committed in support of our Pan-African institutions. Secondly, at the G20, we have started a conversation already of the inclusion of the African multilateral financial institutions in the G20 frameworks. And in this, I can assure you that one of our first action was to highlight the fact that those institutions are the institutions that have a good knowledge of the continent, institutions that have the capacities of navigating the challenges that are facing countries, and institutions that will remain in the continent no matter how difficult the situation will be. And in that, we believe that the G20 has started to listen to that strategic positioning of the AU to say we need to protect our own financial institutions. Just as an indication, we started a conversation also at the G20 to make sure that we have established the African, yesterday I had a problem with that word, the African,
Financing stability mechanism?
The African Financing Stability Mechanism. I don't know why I have a problem with that since yesterday. And it is telling because it is something that is truly in my mind and that we are pushing to support implementation now. So it is shifting in my mind and I hardly had to recognize it, because when you see what we are trying to do with the African Financing Stability Mechanism is to make sure that we provide the level of protection that is needed to our countries that will be certainly facing debt challenges. And in this, we have started a conversation even at the G20 to highlight the fact that Africa is the only continent in the world that doesn't have such a financing stability mechanism. But now the key question that I would like to put forward in terms of the discussion we're having today is that who do we think should take actions on what are our priorities? At the African Union, we are starting to shifting the narrative to say development is a do-it-yourself process. It shouldn't be an imported process. And in that perspective, for us, we are absolutely convinced that the continent has to take its responsibility in terms of setting up its own, financial architecture. First of all, let's be mindful of the fact that we have not yet implemented or we have not yet operationalized the institutions that are provided in Article 19 of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which are the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, the African Investment Bank, and the Pan-African Stock Exchange that was endorsed by member states in 2006. So you can see that if we are able on our side to move forward and to implement those or to establish those institutions, we will be able to create the space for financial stability on the continent. And when we say we are supporting our Pan-African institutions, we have provided always, the platform for those institutions to engage with our leaders here in Addis Ababa and in various countries in the world where we have had the opportunity to engage, to make sure that we provide the policy platform, but also the decision-making processes and platforms that are supporting those institutions to be strengthened and to move forward. In terms of the ratings, we have started the conversation. And if you do recall, in 2023, we have endorsed and we have validated the creation of the African Credit Rating Agency, which should be one of the continental institutions to respond to the imbalances that we see in the international rating system. And in that, we are absolutely convinced that with an African credit rating agency, which will not resolve the problem of the ratings for our countries, but at least it will give an African perspective on what are the real risks on the ground. Dauda highlighted the fact that Africa is the less riskier continent in the world, and it is true. Africa has the less risk, profile in the world. If we take, for instance, infrastructure investment, globally, you will see that Africa, compared to other regions of the world, that can be named here, Europe, Latin America, even America, Africa has the less risk, in terms of infrastructure. But unfortunately, due to the fact that there is a wrong perception of the risk in the continent globally, we have the highest risk premium to pay due to the fact that we are, badly perceived. So our aim is to make sure that we create the space, the continental space, to address this challenge and provide the real estimates of the risk that we are facing on the continent. In terms of, the inclusion of the African financial institutions on debt, I said it already, we are working with the G20, and we do absolutely believe that, in the year to come, we will be able to, to change the narrative and to make sure that, our global partners understand that there is need for inclusion of those institutions in the discussions that are happening, at the G20. And we spoke about the holistic approach, and we spoke about the potential that the Common African Position on Debt has. And I want to assure you that whatever we were able to achieve this year was due to the fact that Africa stood up and could discuss in the continent its position to be tabled to the world. There is no need for us to engage in any advocacy or in any discussion if we fail having a continental position. And I can tell you that the moment we had the conference of Lomé, organized, it changed the understanding that the global players had on the positioning of the continent. And today you can see the results are there. We had the Seville conference where the Lomé Declaration was at the center of the discussion that happened. And if you read the FFD4 outcome document, you can see that on debt, it was mirroring what was in the Lomé Declaration. And we went further to craft a common African position on debt, which is also stipulating Africa's engagement, not only to call on global attention, but to say we have understood that there is a problem in our house. We will address that problem through prudent debt management and through accountability and transparency. That is what we have provided to the world to say we are ready to work, we are ready to correct what we have, seen in the last decades, and that we are ready to engage with global partners to find optimal solutions. And Dauda was absolutely right when he said that, how do we make sure that we are able to disconnect the continent from being, in the same situation in the next decade? It should be reminded that the debt conference that we had in Lomé was already called to be organized in 1983. So you can imagine, in the 80s, we had the same problem. In the 90s, we have the same problem. And in the 20s now, we have the same problem. So there is need for us to think about the structural reforms that are needed to make sure that the continent firmly embarks in a transformative developmental process. And I do believe that we have the resources to do that. We have the youngest population in the world. We have one of the biggest market in terms of the size of the countries participating. And in 2 decades only, we are going to have the biggest market in terms of the number of, in terms of the population, because our population is estimated to move from 1.4 billion that we have today to nearly 2.7 billion in just 2 decades, which means that Africa will combine the population of China and India in one space. So what do we do to make sure that we create a space for prosperity, for economic transformation, and for transformative process in the continent? The only option is to make sure that we make the most of our resources. Making the most of our resources means fighting against illicit financial flows, fighting against corruption, fighting against profit shifting, and more importantly, reducing the risk perception that we have on the continent. This is what we can do, and this is what we have tasked ourselves at the African Union to work with our member states to ensure that in the decades that is ahead of us, that we are able to create the space for prosperity on the continent. Rest assured that it is not a simple task, and it has never been said it will be simple. If I tell you how it was difficult to even imagine that we can have a G20 ministerial declaration on debt, but we were able to do it. Dauda is in the room. He can tell you how difficult it is to have a discussion, with the G20 members on debt, including, the fact that considering the geopolitical dynamics that we spoke about, there is no consensus on the approach that needs to be taken to move forward. So it is something that we see as a positive sign, and we do believe that in the year to come, during the G20 American presidency, we will have more positive results in terms of what we can get for the continent. Let me conclude by saying that no one could imagine that Americans could consider growth as one of their priority, debt sustainability, critical minerals. We've been able to put forward a coherent, strategic positioning that has called the attention of Americans. Considering the difficult times in which we are today, it is a great sign of success. And I can tell you that we have aimed to achieve success, and we will continue to move in that direction. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olomo, for those remarks. I think they really set the scene for the next segment of our discussion. Just before we go there, I just want to highlight a couple of things from Dr. Olomo's remarks to ensure that firstly, we need to understand that in proposing the solutions that we're proposing, we need to understand that we're navigating in an extremely turbulent environment. And so our solutions and our approach needs to reflect that and to also consider that. Also reflecting on the G20 Africa Engagement Framework that has recently been endorsed as a platform for sustained engagement, African engagement. And I would pose to us in the room to maybe reflect on how we can feed into that process and how we can ensure that the South African presidency is not the only one that reflects or that spotlights African engagement within the G20. Dr. Olomo also highlighted some of the challenges that are faced in terms of having these discussions within the G20 as well. He also highlighted the critical importance of moving forward in terms of the African Financing Stability Mechanism, but also highlighting that this year has been a year of significant strides and really a testament to what concerted effort by African actors can achieve, particularly on the G20 Declaration on Debt. And perhaps Dr. Olomo, already I would want to maybe probe you on some of the factors that you believe really made the debt conference work, despite not having worked within the last 40 years. What about this particular engagement and this particular initiative this year made the positive outcome, or created the positive outcome? And with that being said, I think I'll just, in the interest of time, move on to our next segment so that we also give the opportunity to everyone in the room and online to also give their reflections, questions, etc. And then we can have the targeted discussion. May I kindly request that my discussants that are in the room join me up here for this part of the discussion. And then Dr. Olomo and Atmasu online to just remain there for the discussion. Dauda and Aja, please. Do we have any questions, comments, reflections from around the room based on the discussions that we've had so far? Can I get some assistance with the mic? Oh, thanks. Elizabeth? Okay.
Thanks very much. This has been a very, very rich discussion and sort of coming at it from different perspectives, which has been really useful, highlighting a couple of points. I just want to sort of make one observation and then just reinforce another point that has been made by several speakers. The first relates to the issue of public development banks or national development banks. I think you alluded to it, Dauda, but I'm not quite sure what the figures are in Africa, but I know that the work of Mariana Mazzucato has put, what, 22, 23 trillion dollars that are floating around in public development banks, and making the point, the importance of actually working together and coordinating with multilaterals and regional development banks to actually make up the financing gap. I mean, I don't know what the figures are on the continent. I know South Africa's Development Bank of Southern Africa plays an important role, certainly in the region. There is the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa, but it would really be interesting to reflect a little on that and how we can actually bring, or are they in the conversations? Can we bring them into the conversations to leverage much more? That's the first point. And the second point really is the point about alliances and coalitions. I think the coalitions outside of Africa, even within the G20, and we saw that this year with a number of the initiatives that South Africa did, not just in the finance track, but I would argue also in the Sherpa track, where South Africa worked with a number of countries that really supported some of its initiatives, whether it was on illicit financial flows or on global public goods. And so that is important. And I think it will become even more important. And then the other point that you stressed around the role that actors outside of the state sector can play in mobilizing. I mean, there have been some really interesting studies also around tax that show, this was done a few years ago, that show that basically when you're sitting in the room, for example, in the Inclusive Forum, OECD BEPS Inclusive Forum, some of the actors that even just have observer status in those conversations can actually play a much stronger advocacy role than the countries themselves who have seats. So that's the point that you reiterated this morning, Dauda, and I think Bart had said about power. Presence doesn't equate to power. And I think we have to identify those actors in these various forums and engage with them in a much more, engage with them in a coordinated fashion to make sure that this happens. I mean, in the context of tax, for example, and I know this is already happening, ATAF, the Africa Tax Administration Forum, I think is a very important player in that regard, coordinates, provides capacity, etc., for African countries. So those points are really, really critical.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Do we have any other interventions, questions? Oh.
Hi, Thank you very much. This was a very rich discussion and a nice follow-up from yesterday's also very rich discussion. I think Patrick, what he said in the room is the challenge of having a ministerial declaration on debt. It was very challenging, but then if you understand the process of how the G20 work by consensus, by definition, these declarations are not going to move the needle because you need to have consensus. Consensus means that, you know, and Patrick was in the room. We were in the room together. He pushed as much as he could, but he had to do it in a consensual way. So some interests are not always going to be aligned. So you're going to always have a declaration that is not going to be perceived as ambitious. And I think some of the things that we need to do is how you build these, you know, bilateral discussions in the background. Right. So if you're talking about debt, there are a couple of big countries that have very opposing views on debt, and that is going to affect how you actually the ministerial declaration comes about. How do you pull them aside in the background and sort of work some of these our points and see where you can also support them on other needs? For example, some of those countries are trying to push some reforms at the IMF level. Maybe that's an angle to you to push. So we need to have also, as we're doing advocacy, a lot of research behind the scenes on what are the different countries' interests and how we can actually have our interests that are aligned on particular topics. I think that work is also part of the behind the scenes work that we need to continue to do at the G20 so that the seat can become more effective. On the topic that you mentioned on the public development banks, I mean, the Financing Commons Summit was quite good. The FIX Israel has a really, really big focus on public development banks. I can certainly tell you the African development banks with the new leadership is something that we are working on, and actually having a coalition to really reinforce the public development banks and what is going to be the role of the African Development Bank. It is obviously also no secret that the African Development Bank, our African Development Fund, is going for replenishment, the 17th replenishment. It's a very challenging environment. We have our final meeting in mid-December in London. We had a third replenishment meeting in Lusaka a few weeks ago, at the beginning of October. That'll be a good litmus test to really see where we are in terms of ODA, in terms of shifting donor priorities. I think having an ambitious ADF replenishment, at least is language that we have in the Leaders' Declaration, and we would need your support. So one call to action is to really support a strong, ambitious ADF replenishment at the end of the year to make sure that language is actually in the Leaders' Declaration. In the background, we're working on it. The first draft of the Leaders' Declaration, the language is not strong enough, but to the extent that the people behind the scenes can really make sure that we have that, that'll be a big win, similar to what was done in the IDA process last year. We're really hoping for a really big replenishment. The scenarios that we're working through right now, at least we're coalescing towards something, but really need an extra push in order to really get something, because we have a strong pipeline of projects. The needs are humongous, and we really need the coalition to help us with that. Otherwise, just thank you for the opportunity to share some of my experiences in the room. And then my salutations also to the distinguished panelists in Admasu and in Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any additional, can I please have a mic over there?
Thanks, all the speakers. I mean, very excellent interventions indeed. And I guess what's really encouraging, especially in terms of the collaboration between the South African G20 presidents and the African Union, is to hear that, you know, there has been really excellent coordination in as far as pushing the agenda is concerned. But more importantly, the fact that we are already doing a kind of what I would call a review in terms of how the two critical parties have worked together and how we intend to, you know, to continue the engagement. And the coming in of the African engagement framework, I think, is a very positive development. But what I would want to, you know, to just understand about the African engagement framework is how other stakeholders going to participate within the African engagement framework. And I would like to refer back to yesterday's conversation, and there was a very great suggestion from Dr. IBRIMA around, sort of continue, replicating the G20 structure where you have the engagement groups that would feed into the African Union. And I think that is really an excellent, recommendation. And I would want to just get some input from Dr. Patrick in terms of how the non-state actors, in the form of the engagement groups, your T20, your B20, can feed into, the engagement of the African Union. I mean, there are issues I think that Dauda raised around, collaboration, that collaboration must be holistic. We should be talking about collaboration among the think tanks. And I think the African Union, again, they have done well that with the launch of the African think tank platform, which was really a call for proposal, bringing together the African think tanks to respond to the needs of the African continent is a good start, but obviously that call for proposal, the proposals are depending on the framing of the research institutions themselves. And what you would want to see really is the African Union possibly putting out areas of interest which would feed into these various engagements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Then I will go to Maggie and then Nogutula. Sorry? I'm noting it down, sir.
Thank you so much. I think I just wanted to make a very small comments. So one of the things that keeps coming out is the perception of risk that is out there for Africa. And obviously, as we've engaged also in the past couple of months and over the past 3 years with Africa Catalysts and UNDP and partners, when it's come to credit ratings, one of the things we've noticed has been that there is a missing link in terms of what is really happening on ground, or even just the methodologies are not reflecting the realities of African countries. And I want to go beyond and, just put this across, and maybe as we are putting our recommendations together, how even within the G20, we can influence global perception beyond just reports, but also engage further in terms of maybe a continental communication strategy that really has a unified kind of messaging that pushes the African narrative. I think the UN itself has reported that UN reports are not read enough, which shows that in as much as we push out the research, people do not really read it. But how do we reflect the findings and get that to influence this narrative? The G20 in itself really draws a lot of media attention, as we've seen. And I think the question is, how do we take advantage of that and work on a strategy that has a unified messaging that just goes beyond the discussions or the reports and outcomes that we churn out. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Nuktula, and then we'll come back to the discussion.
No, thank you very much. So I think the discussions have been rich, and what we can say is that having the G20 on African soil has provided much impetus and spotlight. My question is really around how we can support the African Union to ensure that even in future presidencies, this impetus stays, African priorities stay on the table on one hand, but on the other hand, that all African countries are able to garner their weight and contribute towards the agenda, because I think issues of debt, issues of cost of capital are affecting all countries, not just one. So how do we work with you at the African Union in order to be able to make sure that this is something that ends up not just as a discussion at G20, but something that actually has crucial benefits for our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I will now turn to my discussants to address any of the questions that you would like to address, and also put in some concluding remarks. I'll start with you, Dauda, particularly around Elizabeth's points around being able to reach consensus, the role of outside actors in the various forums, and I think she also made a point around public development banks as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say that actually from what I heard more sort of comments that I fully agree with than more questions. So let me start with actually what Elizabeth was saying. I do agree. I think the public development banks are a force to be reckoned with, and we cannot actually have any discussion around how we can make the financial sector more performing in Africa without leveraging that the power of those banks. You're right. I think the Finance in Common actually highlighted that as of now, there are more than 530 public development banks that are member of that network. And out of them, 20% are from Africa. More than 100 public development banks are in Africa. Of course, when you say that their balance sheet is sort of equal more than 20 trillion, that's true. But of course, we have to recognize that those that are based in Africa represent a smaller share. But what I can see in terms of how we can leverage their sort of lending capacity, for instance, is in an environment where many countries do have very limited fiscal space, is how we can actually leverage potential co-financing sort of mechanism with, let's say, African multilateral financial institutions or global MDBs like ISDB, for instance, how through partnership between those organizations, they can actually be able to attract more resources that they can, of course, on lend to small SMEs, for instance, or even government. So I think that's where we can actually very much focus and hopefully find some ways. Of course, there are other innovative instruments for using their capabilities. So we need to do that. On the second point about, I think, the coalitions and non-state actors, I fully agree. And I think there is no better sort of person who is more suited to lead that effort than you as the head of SAIA, which is, of course, coordinating the T20. Definitely, you have a great role to play in support of our of South Africa, but also the African Union that are representing Africa there. And I think you've been doing it. I've seen a lot of initiative, including this one actually, that we are discussing now, where SAIA has taken the lead in sort of leveraging and convening all these non-state actors. And I think this is something that will continue, needs to continue, not just ahead of the Leaders Summit, not just during the South African presidency, but even beyond, because this is something that definitely the African Union will continue to need, South Africa will continue to need for making, having a greater impact at the G20. I fully agree also with what the AFDB representative said, Sheikh said, in terms of the importance of IDA. This is definitely something that needs to be pushed for. It has a lot of implications on whether it's on debt, whether it's on development finance, whether it's on making more concessional finance available. And definitely having a successful replenishment is a must and is a precondition for making one, a step ahead. One final word I would want to make is also, we have to keep in mind that we are heading to another presidency. Yesterday, I think a lot of people talked about it. It's going to be the US that is going to come with totally very I don't know, maybe most likely a very disruptive approach. So what it means is we also need to keep in mind that the work should go beyond the South African presidency to make sure that we keep pushing for African priorities. But we also need to keep in mind that it's not only the G20 that is the forum where we need to focus on. There are many other global forums that we need also to leverage. Even some of them, we are not part of it. I can think of, for instance, of the G7. G7, we have potential allies who are leading. So the UK now, next is going to be France. How can we leverage those platforms to push also for the African development agenda? I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. One other thing that we need to keep in mind is the traction or the impact of a G20 presidency is not always something that you can see during the year of the presidency. So what we mean here is definitely the seeds that South Africa is planting is something that has the potential to sort of flourish later on, even after the G20. And we need to push for that. But for that, one thing that is critical is that we just don't stop at putting on the table of the G20 leaders, the work that South Africa has done. South Africa needs to continue to push for the recommendations and initiative that it has come up with during its presidency. And one good way to do it is, for instance, next in February, when the African Union hold its summit in Addis, that something that South Africa needs to very much leverage to make sure that they continue to push for the same initiative that they have been pushing for during their presidency. Beyond the African Union summit also, that work needs to continue, not just by South Africa, but by South Africa, non-state actors like think tank that are supporting, beyond think tank, of course, MDBs that are here and supporting, of course, African countries, and beyond that, of course, all the stakeholders, non-state stakeholders that are very much interested in making sure that Africa has a way to push forward its development priorities. I think all of that is important and we need to keep it in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dauda. I'll now turn online to Admasu to give us his remarks and reflections on the comments that have been posted on the floor.
Thank you, Kessa. Just very quickly, just to start by reacting to Elizabeth's comment around African public development banks, broadly defined. I think we've heard from colleagues that there's about 100 or so in the continent, but the truth, of course, is we know most of those balance sheets are not strong. I think the key opportunity going forward, and maybe something we can crystallize as part of the recommendations, is to, in the G20 process, is to ask for specific execution of the Seville consensus. Some of you may know a few months ago, there was the 4th International Conference on Development Financing. It's a global conference, a major UN conference. And one of the outcomes there was in the context of shrinking ODA and shrinking capacity and even interest to support international development, MDBs have to step in and really start picking up some of the slack. And so there was a resolution that said MDB balance sheets should be tripled 3 times between now and 2030. Now, that's an opportunity for MDBs to scale up and do more. And Elizabeth, I think the question is some national DFIs, such as the effective ones that are strong and well governed and well regarded, such as DBSA and ITC, they can also be part of that MDB process of scaling up. I think they can also capture some of this sort of global finance that might be coming into the balance sheet of MDBs. But I think, as other speakers have said, sometimes these global declarations happen, these global directions get agreed upon, but then, like climate finance and many other types of finance, it just rarely flows in adequate magnitude to Africa. So I think we should just try to find a way to hold the feet to the fire of these global stakeholders so that when all these beautiful consensus points are achieved, they at least there's a mechanism to follow through or to sort of hold their hands and encourage follow up and execution. Just last week, in fact, on this past Friday, there was a big summit, as some of you may know, the African Union, together with AMFI, this collective of African multilateral financial institutions that was referred to by Patrick and others. We had a very interesting resolution, and it's on the Twitter account of the AU and AYUDA, as well as the government of Angola, which chairs the AU at the moment. We announced a $1.5 billion co-financing envelope to support priority infrastructure projects that the AU had put onto the table. And that was coupled with $100 million of project preparation funds. And it did catch some attention because this is the first time that a group of African multilateral DFIs have come together and really thrown their weight more specifically, more deliberately behind some of these priority projects that have not moved fast enough in the past, as we all know. And so there's some interesting traction we're getting there. And so I think for AMFI to be effective, we need to sort of dovetail with the Seville consensus and make sure that some of this new flows of financing to development finance as a whole is going to come into the African space, because we have African capital, but we need international capital too. We can't do it with our own money. I think just one thing to be a little bit, I guess, provocative is as we engage on policy, the global stage, I think we just need to also be a little bit mindful of what some of the issues are at the global level that's sort of interfering and slowing us down in terms of scaling up our institutions and getting the right level of treatment that we need to be strong. And I think this is really about frameworks, policy frameworks, in the IMF and elsewhere that change, that get adjusted. And I think, as the lady said, sometimes having presence in the room does not translate into effective influence, right? So we have people in some of these forums, Africans representing us, but sometimes they don't catch these very important shifts that happen in policy frameworks that really undermine our intentions and our capacity and our positioning. And so I spent a lot of time going back and forth to both the IMF and the Paris Club, of course, the World Bank as well. And just trying to make sure that we are following closely some of these policy developments. And I think this has to do with not just communication, as was mentioned, but it's about engagement and informed engagement so that we can actually catch issues and be part of these critical decisions that get taken. And then we end up reacting as Africans because we realize that they're hurting us, but we only pick up on these ex post. And to walk back these decisions are very difficult in these global institutions. So I don't know. I think there's some more thought we need to have around how we can ensure that our political leaders, whether it's countries or institutions, have very strong technical capacity backing them up to sort of follow what is happening in some of these key forums, because we often are just reactive. We're not able to capture things in good time. And then just on the African financial sector stability mechanism that's been referred to by several speakers, I think even before we get to such a strong mechanism that has never existed before, part of that mechanism is the existing African financial institutions that are systemic in Africa. And, if we can't even ensure that the Pan-African systemic institutions are being safeguarded, it's very odd for us to start talking about a much bigger objective of a mechanism, a financial sector stability mechanism, when the constituent parts are now being cut at the knees. So I think as these discussions take place, I think we need to make sure that we're not talking about some beautiful ideal intervention around the corner when the here and now is being undermined. So we just need to combine those two and make sure that we're not losing sight of our present day realities as we're seeking bigger solutions. And so I'll stop here. I just wanted to thank everybody for the excellent discussions. It's been quite meaningful, and I'm glad to see that we're all really in the driver's seat now in terms of at least having the visibility, the understanding, and the focus on the issues that are very material for us at a time when the world is backing away from Africa from a financial perspective. I think the G20 next time round, we don't know if already this pulling back is going to continue. Maybe the G20 may not be so interested in our issues going forward. Who knows? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Masood. I think the point around follow through and a follow-up mechanism, particularly in light of the declarations that come out of these processes like the G20, is particularly relevant. I'll now turn to you to offer your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think many of the points have been addressed by our really distinguished speakers. I'll just maybe emphasize two things. Of course, we support the replenishment of ADF, but for me, this brings another question. In terms of coherence, we are all aware and acknowledge that right now the context in terms of fiscal space, etc., we have greatly and extensively mentioned these things, allude to really the constraints in terms of financing. So us as MDBs, again, if we want to be efficient and maximize the impact, it is important that we also collectively, besides the fact that we are championing co-financing, etc., as measures and leverages to pool these resources, but it's also important that we come together in terms of vision on what we want to find. So resources are very scarce. We might have a concessional financing window that we are setting up. We have the ADF, we have ADA, etc. But in the end, all of these are coming from the same resources. So really, how do we unify and pull this together for greater impact? I think it's a very important question. One other thing, I think Maggie mentioned something about perception. And I think that also we need to start by applying it to ourselves. I'll give the example of my institution, ISDB. We have entities that are private sector arms that are here to support our member countries to sort of free up some fiscal space and have more off-balance sheets financing. But we are very much reliant on the perception that is already given. Even ourselves, we are reluctant when it comes to financing some of our member countries, whether it's LDMCs or other fragile states. So are we failing on that front? Not, but we need to really be coherent with ourselves and try to work on that aspect of perception and turn it into a reality first within our own institutions. So I think these are very, very important points that we need to take into account. Also, following through, as many of us have mentioned. And that's why I was saying, you know, when we're running a project program, we know that there is an implementation unit, we know who's accountable, etc. So I think that's why it's very important, again, to have champions that each of us as stakeholders know that we can sort of hold accountable to the decisions we have taken. So I think that's just what I wanted to add. And thank you very much. This was very enriching, and hopefully something fruitful will come out of it.
Thank you very much, Aja, for those reflections. I think the emphasis really around champions is one that we need to take forward and really implement within the recommendations as well, to identify those champions who can really move the needle and be held accountable for those actions. I will now turn over to Dr. Olomo to just address some of the points that were made here, just to maybe pinpoint the one around the African engagement framework and how non-state actors can really feed into that process, as well as the comment around replicating the G20 structure of engagement groups at AU level to really feed into the process. Dr. Olomo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Keza, and thanks to all the previous speakers for so eloquently putting forward very excellent points. The first thing I want to say is that in terms of engaging with various stakeholders, the African Union has already made significant move forward. First, if we look at what happened during the G20 South African presidency, I'm not sure that they have been already in our settings such an inclusive framework where all the stakeholders, the AU, the Pan-African institutions, but also the civil society organization and various other constituencies were able to come together to reflect on what could be done to support the continent in this direction. I want to tell you that we are working already with some of the civil society organizations that are supporting us in important agenda items such as illicit financial flows, fight in the continent. We spoke about domestic resource mobilization. And in this, we are working, as was highlighted by Elizabeth, with ATAF, with TGNA, and with many other institutions. The African Development Bank and the AMFI members are part of what we call the African Union G20 Knowledge Partners. And before every G20 meeting, we usually convene some meetings to make sure that we align our perspectives before we get into the G20 room, which makes that when the AU submits its points during the G20 meeting, those points will be relayed by UNECA and by the African Development Bank. When we spoke about the replenishment of the African Development Fund, we were requesting that replenishment that came from an assembly decision at the AU, because we have been supporting that process since 2022. And in this, we are continuing to make sure that the replenishment of the African Development Fund becomes a reality. But saying this could not only mean that funds that are supporting the ADF replenishment should come from external sources. We should think about what African countries can do in supporting that process, providing the resources that will be domestic resources aligned to support Africa's development. So we are working on that, and we are absolutely sure that in the month to come, maybe we can have good news from an African perspective on the replenishment. But we are also engaging international partners to make sure that we secure the amount of resources that can support the continent's economic transformation. So in terms of working with engagement groups, I think we have the possibility and the space to create more advocacy platforms such as this that we have today. We are discussing here. You can see the AU is there. Since yesterday, I have been here since the start of the meeting, which is extremely difficult for me to attend a meeting from the beginning till the end. I did it since yesterday. we are not here because we want to, just be here. I am here because I'm learning to listen, and I'm listening to learn and to understand what could be the positions that we can put forward when we discuss at the G20. We are now crafting the G20 Leaders Summit Declaration that will be released in South Africa, I think on 23rd of November. What you have said here will certainly be part of the submissions that we're going to put forward during that negotiating process. So you can see that we've had an opportunity already to harness your wisdom and to make sure that that wisdom becomes, an essential point that we can put forward in the G20. This is what we call inclusive participatory frameworks. And that we can continue promoting it in any forms that could be. It can be engagement frameworks, it can be, informal discussions as we are having today, but those discussions needs to be regularly organized. And for next year, we have a platform at the African Union, which is the Fridays of the Commission. I do believe that with Elizabeth and all the other stakeholders that are in the room, and Dauda was part of that, one of our discussion when we had a discussion on the G20, he even moderated the session. I think we have the opportunity today, to create the real narrative of an Africa's transformation that is fueled by African priorities. We have that possibility, we will work for that, and we'll make sure that we get there. So that is what I can do, but rest assured that in terms of coordination, the African Union is open to, to coordinate and to collaborate with all the state and non-state actors to make sure that we get the most of our engagement in the G20. So thank you once again. I would have to let you continue the meeting because I have another G20 meeting starting that started 6 minutes ago. So I have to move to that meeting, and sincerely thank you for the opportunity, for the platform, and wish you success in your deliberation. Over to you, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lomo, for being with us, especially for staying with us since yesterday and today, really sharing some very valuable input, and also reaffirming that these discussions, are being heard and are being reflected in the AU's engagement. With that being said, I think I'd like to thank my discussants very much for your valuable input and recommendations. And in terms of reflecting on the way forward, I think it would be important to incorporate some of these inputs and really share the draft document so that we're able to co-create something that can really yield fruits and be the basis for sustained engagement moving forward. Thank you very much to everyone else in the room for having taken the time, and also your valuable inputs that have really enriched the discussions. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of incorporating some of these insights and ensuring that this meeting did not take place in vain. So thank you very much. And with that being said, Elizabeth, do you wanna? Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Admasu Online as well, for your very valued input.
I think we've had a really engaged 2 days or day and a half, I think, which is not just included a technical discussion, but I think also much more importantly, how you take the technical discussions and drive them, advocate them, and also get political will, which we said, I think, in the first day was really, really important. So I don't want to just, I don't want to regurgitate a lot of what we've heard. There were some really excellent ideas that we as a community can also take forward. I think issues that Maggie raised around communication strategies reminded me about, and perceptions reminded me of a case study that was done by an organization called On Think Tank, which took a sort of series of research that an American think tank had undertaken on a particular issue that was happening in the South China Sea. And they converted it into sort of a 10-minute video. And that was the video that caught the attention of the State Department and the White House. So, the point about not reading research, you need the research, but then your communication strategy is so important. In issues of supporting the AU, the point that Nokutula raised, I think is also about really not just supporting the AU in the context of G20, really developing coordinated African community approach that tackles global economic governance, because we also have recognized that G20 is simply one platform. There are so many others, and we need to make sure, there you are, Nokutula. We need to make sure that we coordinate across all of these platforms, that the finance ministries are speaking to the foreign ministries, are speaking to the environmental ministries, are speaking to the science and technology ministries, etc., when these are talking and are representing Africa and their respective countries in different forums. Because sometimes you have the foreign ministry saying one thing in one forum and the finance ministry is taking a different position in another forum. And I think that's what we really need to get right, both within our countries, by the way, and continentally. So this is not just that. I thought it would be important to flag, and I know I'm saying more than I should, but I thought it would be important to flag in the context of the point somebody made that it's not just looking at the forums we are in, but also the forums we are not in. And one of the examples was the G7, but also to think about how we're going to engage, for example, UK conference in the UK, which I think is happening next year. And I'm now also going through what Patrick was dealing with in terms of not remembering. But I think it was on illicit financial flows and debt, or there are two separate conferences in the UK on this next year. I stand to be corrected. I think these are important forums that for us as sort of knowledge actors, we should also be thinking of taking some of these messages through. And it will come to me probably later exactly what this conference was. But I mean, let me just end on some of those comments that we heard this morning. I think the idea as proposed by Catherine yesterday was that we will be working on a brief sort of outcome document. The negotiations are not going to be as complicated or time consuming as they are for the leaders' declaration. It's really just to capture some of the important messages that we want to be able to communicate directly and effectively. And then all that really remains for me to say is just to express my deepest gratitude. In the first instance, to all the panelists who have given of their time. And here specifically, I want to also mention Patrick, who has sort of been a diehard supporter. But then the partnerships that we have established through this conference, and really AfriCatalyst, I can't express my appreciation enough. All I can say is you're all invited to South Africa. I know I'm invited back to Senegal, but you're invited to South Africa, where we would like to also extend the same hospitality. But I think it's been a wonderful collaboration. I know it's taken a lot of hard work and effort. So really to commend you, Dada, and your fantastic team. Really, thank you very much. The UNDP has been with us through a series of such outreaches with the continent, continued to be a really important partner and one of the global players that is so important for think tanks to really be working with and engaging, and really committed to building up capacity of the African continent in meaningfully engaging in these discussions, these debates. And then, of course, Outer NEPAD, that's another sort of long-standing partner and co-conspirator in all of these activities. I know they weren't able to be here in person these 2 days, but really, really a very big thank you. And then, of course, to all of you, to the interpreters, who have to sort of make do even when we talk fast. And to the technical team, it sounds like an Oscar award ceremony. And to the technical team, the guys who've been keeping the live streaming going, and then to the excellent comments from all of you, the excellent research that you have all been doing, Monsieur over there. Really, I think this has been a really, really stimulating 2 days, and I thank you all for making it that. So I suppose now lunch is served, right? Yes. 12:30. So you have to. Hey? And there's a group photo again. Well, that's fine. You know, repetition is. I know there was something they say about repetition. What's the story with the pictures?